Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my Author's Answer video for July 2023. The Author's Answer series was started by AuthorTuber J.D. Archer and his writing group, which I believe they met through his blog, and I'll link down below to the blog because for a couple of years they answered weekly questions about their writing or reading habits. And then JD answered some of those questions himself also on AuthorTube, so I'll link to his playlist down below. And I found this a couple of years ago and have been answering these questions sequentially, one per month ever since, so I'll link to my playlist also down below. And this month I am up to question number 75, which is to talk about some of your earliest writing, but maybe to go a little bit past earliest childhood, if like me, you're somebody who did some early childhood writing, and to talk more about your teenage writing. But the first thing I tend to think about lately is my first novel, which was an 82-page handwritten novel that I wrote when I was 11 called Captured by Fate. And it was a George and the Dragon retelling, probably based off of a picture book I had. At the time, I felt like I was pulling things out of thin air, but of course I wasn't. It was a story about a peasant boy named Colin Bugle who went off to fight a dragon, Agatha, and win the hand of Princess Heather, who was engaged to this antagonistic fellow called Prince Bill, and I was very insistent he had to be called Prince Bill, and maybe this has tendrils that reach to today. I'm now writing a fantasy novel that's an Iron Age secondary world setting, and one of my beta readers is annoyed by some of my vernacular dialogue I use. So anyway, I tend to think of that as like the beginning of my teenage writing, although ultimately, I feel like my teenage writing became much more realist in tone, or at least gothic, although not with the supernatural elements. But probably most of the novels I attempted to start and stop were a little more autobiographical about, well, I'm not sure exactly. I don't remember a lot of the specifics. I know that they almost always starred, young teenage girls like myself, and so I was probably working through some, familiar things or things I was thinking about. But the story I remember the most, quite embarrassingly, was not even so much gothic as just melodramatic. And it took place in a reclusive home, and all the people in town like really distrusted the family who lived there. There were 4 siblings. The oldest daughter died years ago before any of the other siblings were born. Then the oldest son was sent off to boarding school, and he became obsessed with his surviving sister, who was being forced to stay in the house, I guess, so that she wouldn't die how her sister did. And she and her younger brother, who was very sick, were forced to stay in the house, and so her brother, who was in boarding school, was obsessed with her. The brother, who was younger than her, actually hated her, and I think there was a murder attempt at one point. And she herself had very little by way of personality, which is maybe the most embarrassing part of that story. But I remember, being deep in the feels, the dramatic feels for that one. But actually, I was just going through some of my old papers, because I do have a few, not as many as I'd hope, but I have them like in one of actually the, cubby right down there, just old, writing that I did. And actually, I did do more fantasy writing as a teen and a preteen than I thought. For example, for several years, I took part in a summer writing program that was done through my mother's university where she taught. And I wrote a couple of fantastical pieces. One I don't remember much about, except I think the sister's name was Mariana. I was hoping to find the story in there, but I didn't. The other one was called Wind Dancer, and I at least have some notes in this Lisa Frank journal of this story. So this is my Wind Dancer story, some of the notes. And what I wrote about it is, the Wind Dancer is a story of mythology, but there is a moral in it that everyone should follow in order to become beautiful and strong inside. The setting of the story is a village called Watiki, The people of the village believe in a high goddess called the Wind Dancer. Every year she chooses 3 16-year-old girls to try and join her. They do this by a test. The one who does the best job joins the Wind Dancer. The others go to other goddesses. One year, the Wind Dancer chooses 3 girls named Sena, Thea, and Annalise. Sena's pretty and Thea's strong, but they're both very vain. Annalise has no talents or looks, but is kind to those in need. Who do you think will be allowed to join the Wind Dancer? Read this excerpt about the test to find out. So looking back on that, I guess I'm also a little embarrassed about the heavy dose of moralizing and flat characterization in that one. Although it is interesting to read about goddesses and being chosen by a goddess, because that's another part of this fantasy novel I'm writing right now, is a young girl getting chosen by a goddess, but thank goodness not because she's so much better than everyone else. Another speculative sci-fi thing I wrote a lot of in middle school and high school was fan fiction based off of what was then my favorite television show, which was a Star Trek pastiche for children called Space Cases, which was a Canadian production on Nickelodeon for 2 seasons that came out in the mid-90s. And I wrote fan fiction for it. It was really one of my first forays onto the internet back in the day with my Angel Fire turned GeoCities site. And I wrote the stories in notebooks. This is, you know, my middle school / high school, and I have this beat up notebook, and it has lots of stories. I wrote like, here's some of the stories I wrote, and it goes all the way to the end of this notebook, and then somewhat into this notebook as well. So I was relatively prolific. I mean, they weren't the best stories, and I just think about how science fiction still scares me, and we know that especially the more scientific part of it. But I'm really glad I wrote these. You know, it was such a integral part, I think, to my writing and to other parts of my life as well at the time. And finally, in high school, I actually did publish some poetry in these 2 literary journals that my high school put out, which is something I haven't thought about in years, but I have someone in my writing salon who keeps on asking, you know, for people to join the poetry group. And I haven't written poetry in a long time, but like, here's something I think I wrote my junior year, I think it is. And here's something I wrote as a freshman, an actual sonnet, so that's pretty cool. I tend to think of published poetry as a one-time deal I did in college. In my freshman year of college, I also got a poem published in that literary newsletter, which I believe is online, so I can try to see about linking it down below. And I think that about covers it for me. I've been battling this camera for a while. It, I think, is ready to die on me. So good time for me to, you know, stop and recharge. I think recharge the camera and maybe myself. I feel like I looked back and was rather critical of my writing as a teenager and a preteen, but it is interesting too to see how, you know, all those little steps lead you to where you are now, and I found some common themes even in the fantasy novel I'm writing right now, so I think all of these steps were useful in the overall journey. So if you have any memories of your writing as a preteen or a teen, I'd love to hear about them. And otherwise, I should be back on this channel imminently with a Would You Read It challenge video where I'm looking back at BookTube prize entries from yesteryear and reading the beginnings of the novels and discussing them. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, everyone. Keep writing, and I'll see you next time.